So aloha and welcome to our summer speaker series hosted by the South Kohala Coastal Partnership. I think I know most of everyone in attendance today, but regardless, I'm Julia Rose. I'm with the Nature Conservancy and I coordinate the Coastal Partnership. And before I introduce our speakers today, I'd like to give just a quick introduction to the South Kohala Coastal Partnership so that you can get a glimpse of the big picture and how the work that Willie and Carolyn are sharing today fits within the context of our network. So the region of South Kohala on Hawaii Island was designated as a priority area in 2010 through the Division of Aquatic Resources in the Hawaii Coral Reef Strategy. This means that it was identified as an area with substantial and important coral reefs that were under threat from things like sediment, sewage, unsustainable fisheries, and climate change. And the state saw an opportunity to make progress on these very complicated and cross-cutting issues by building a network of partners to tackle things together in one geography. Which brings us to the model of the South Kohala Coastal Partnership. You may be familiar with the watershed partnerships that exist across the state, where major landowners collaborate to preserve and protect forests and habitat across their boundaries. And when we think of applying that model to the ocean, it doesn't quite work the same since we don't have the same ownership structure in the water. So instead, we work with stakeholders. So entities like community groups, government agencies, nonprofits, other organizations, businesses, researchers, resource managers, and landowners. And at the latest count, we had a total of 71 different partner organizations involved in the network. And we are united under a vision of a restored, healthy, abundant, resilient South Kohala coastal system, cared for and cherished by an island community, guided by the values and traditions of South Kohala. And the network has gone through an iterative planning process to prioritize action that will address impacts to our coastal waters. And in the most recent plan, we identified 6 key strategies to focus on, and these are resilient ocean policy to support community-based fisheries management, soil and watershed management to reduce erosion and sedimentation that is washing down onto the reefs, clean water management to address other pollution like sewage, fertilizer, and other things coming through the groundwater specifically, county and community conservation planning, so working closely with our county planning department to provide science that could inform planning efforts, community connectivity and stewardship, which aims to preserve and enhance the community's connection to place and foster community stewardship and partnerships. And finally, climate threat assessment and response, so we can continue to track the latest research and modeling of climate change impacts and adjust our strategies as we need to. And the structure of the network is formatted so that each of these strategies has a team of partners that is dedicated to implementing them. And we communicate across the network in a couple of ways. And this summer's speaker series is one of those ways that we are starting to do that, because with a network of over 70 partners, it becomes extremely challenging to effectively communicate what every partner is working on simultaneously. So we decided to host these sort of deep dives into individual projects or initiatives to start really communicating across the network. And we are launching this virtual speaker series to continue connecting our work with the community and across our network, focusing on one aspect of our partners' work per talk. And so today, Carolyn Stewart and Willie Rice are here to share about some of the extensive work that has been happening to address erosion in the Pelikane watershed. And before we get started, I did want to highlight just a few housekeeping requests. If everyone could keep themselves on mute during the talk, we will open it up for discussion afterwards. I'm hoping to have at least 20 or 30 minutes for discussion. But during the talk, feel free to put your burning questions in the chat, and we'll try to address those first afterwards. And then when we open it up for questions and discussion, we would love to be able to see your faces if you are able to use your camera. We will be recording the talk to share with those who missed it, so please just make sure everyone's respectful of all participants. And with that, I would like to introduce Carolyn Stewart of Marine and Coastal Solutions International and Willie Rice with Forest Solutions.
Thanks, Julia. Let me see if I can get our presentation up on the screen. Okay, can everybody see the presentation?
Not yet.
That's weird. Let's see. Aha. Okay.
There we go.
Great. All right, welcome to our presentation about restoring watersheds and preventing erosion. I'm Carolyn Stewart, and I've been involved with watershed work in this area since the early 90s. First with the State Coastal Zone Management Program, and then as an independent environmental consultant doing watershed work. So I've been doing this for a long time.
And I'm Willie Rice, and on Julia's little list there, I'm a resource manager. And I've also been working within Pelikane watershed on Queen Emma lands and a dryland restoration project since the early 2000s. Our presentation today is going to address or show you folks the problems, address the causes, and go through the strategies that we've worked on in Pelikane watershed primarily, but kind of in this greater 3 watershed area of Honokoa and Waiulaula that we'll refer to in our presentation as the Kawaihae watershed.
And we weren't sure how many people would be on the presentation that don't know anything about watersheds or haven't had any background information about this area. So we wanted to show this map. These are the 3 watersheds where there has been a lot of attention over the years, and a kind of ongoing attention. And they share some characteristics. They're all on the leeward side of Kohala Mountain, so they're all, they tend to be dry with low rainfall in the lower parts of the watersheds, steep slopes, and intermittent flashy streams. And the primary land cover in these watersheds is rangeland. Some of it grazed by cattle, some of it ungrazed by cattle, but with plenty of goats. So I'm sure that everyone sort of recognizes this scenario, that you've looked out to the ocean after a storm and seen this brown water along the coast. Most of the time, the streams in these watersheds are dry in the lower elevations, and they only flow during big storm events. And that's what we mean when we call them flashy streams. But then when we have a large storm, this is often what happens. The stormwater flows into the ocean, carrying with it all the sediment that sort of sits there offshore until it settles in the bottom. And you can look at the specific stream channels, and this, again, this happens with all of them. This is Honokoa Gulch, after a storm. Here is the mouth of Pelikani Bay below the Heiau at Kohala. And here's the stream that crosses over the coral flats and discharges into the back of Kawaihae Harbor. And you can see that these types of storm events are discharging a lot of sediment into Kawaihae Harbor, which in essence serves as a big sediment retention basin and then regularly needs to be dredged in order to remove the sediment. This is a picture from Waimea, but this shows sort of again, flooding and that sediment-laden stormwater flow from a couple streams. Waikoloa Stream are the pictures in the top right and the bottom left during the 2004 flood, and then Keanui-Omano Stream going under Waiaka Bridge in that same storm. So again, when we have heavy rainfall in this region, it generates a lot of stormwater, a lot of flow, and that stormwater is carrying in it a lot of suspended sediment. And when that stormwater flow with the sediment is discharged into the nearshore waters, it has a negative impact on the coral reefs and our nearshore ecosystems. And so that's really why there's been such a great effort to try to implement projects on the ground to reduce that erosion, the loss of sediment from the landscape.
So the problems are usually pretty self-evident and right there in your face. Causes of these problems can be as well sometimes and sometimes not so much. But you need time in the field. You need to be out there observing to find out what the causes of these problems are. You need good communication and collaboration with landowners, neighbors, even within an organization, between your workers to sort out what might be going on out there. Go ahead. So we're on 9, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the obvious causes here throughout the Kawaihae watersheds are goats. The goats showed up in the 80s and they've been getting worse since, and the population has gone up and down based on hunting and trapping. They're here all the time, and that's part of the problem. They focus in on areas and cause destruction, such as you see in the top right picture there. That fence line, there's lots of goats on the right side there, and none, if any, goats on the left. But the fact that they're there all the time creates this problem of erosion. Go ahead. So here you see a wildfire came through. This is in 2015. And it's a great example of the 1-2 punch of wildfire and a big flood happening a few weeks after, and you see the bay there full of sediment. Some people may say, hey, wildfire is not that bad. Rangeline grasses come back right afterwards. And peely grass, if you have native peely grass out in your landscape, that recovers and does well underneath a burning regime, etc. But it's these fountain grasses and buffalo grasses and these fire adapted grasses that are really widespread throughout these areas that contribute to this grass fire cycle that most people know very well. And when those burn, you know, they leave bare ground, which is highly susceptible to erosion. Here's some great maps by Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization. And the one on the left there is showing fire perimeters over a 20-year period between 99 and 2019, as well as fire ignition points, which are the red dots. And then today I put on the red arrow there, so you can see where that fire was last night. And it's already burned there once before. I don't have a date on that, but it's obviously in the last 20 years. But you know, this is just to highlight that fire is a big problem here. And the map on the right with the wildfire ignitions shows that we have two, more than two actually, fires per square mile per year, ignitions per square mile per year. And it's obvious with that bright yellow color on that map.
Yeah, Kawaihae Road is a big ignition point all along that roadway.
So much of the grasses in the watersheds are invasive and fire adapted, and they proliferate because of that grass fire cycle. They tend to outcompete any native grasses like peely grass. They invade the forest, and when they catch fire, obviously that forest disappears, and the grasses come in to replace that forest. The cows in particular, they like these fire adapted grasses as well. And sorry, I've totally lost my place here. Moving on. The natural erosion is a natural process here in Hawaii, but not the rates that we're currently seeing throughout Kawaihae watershed. The excessive erosion we've seen on this landscape are due to the combination of all of these causes.
And as we see more and more effects of climate change, we can probably expect longer and more frequent droughts in some areas, and these really inhibit vegetation recovery, making some of our work even more challenging.
But there's also seasonality to the place. These are permanent photo plots of an enclosure over a 4-year period and in different times of the year. And sometimes it's just nature, and you've got to learn to work with nature when you're doing restoration and when you're doing your science too, and realize that sometimes you don't always get exactly what you want.
So what are some of the strategies to help address these problems? We really wanted to kind of compile some examples of the range of activities and management practices that have been implemented on the ground over the past 25 years here in this area to help address these problems that are these drivers that are really causing the problems we have with erosion in these watersheds. Some of the strategies have been more successful than others, but you know, it's very much a learning experience, a learning process with everything we do. While the Pelikani watershed has received the most attention really since the mid-90s, that was the first watershed where people sort of said, wait, you know, there's a real problem here and we need to do something. But work has started more recently, relatively speaking, in both the Wai'ulaula and Honoko'a watersheds. So that's really good news. But from my vantage point of having worked in these watersheds for the past 25 years, they are in so much better shape than they were 25 years ago. So I'm very hopeful about the future. So one of the critical aspects, I think, of sort of successful watershed projects in these watersheds is undertaking a watershed planning effort initially that engages the range of stakeholders within the watersheds, and it results in the development of a watershed management plan that articulates goals and objectives for the watershed, as well as implementing measures. And we're fortunate that in this 3 watershed area, that we have a number of plans that have already been developed and that have really helped us facilitate getting funding for on-the-ground projects. So I think having these plans, and you can see there's still another plan in process, but having these plans has really helped us be able to do work in the watersheds. And then, of course, as Julia mentioned in her initial presentation, the establishment of the South Kohala Coastal Partnership has really been key to really generating some momentum around some of our watershed efforts. It's really has created this synergistic forum in which we can kind of collectively problem solve about erosion and some of the other landscape scale issues in these watershed areas. You know, in the past, the watershed work that was done was much more piecemeal, with different groups and land users working in different, more independently in specific watersheds, and less of that collaborative work across ownership boundaries on common issues. So I really feel like the partnership has been key to some of the momentum. I think that's the best word that we're seeing now in these watersheds.
So part of that collaboration has come with USGS, and this is Karina, right? John Stock and Karina, and don't ask me to pronounce her last name. But they've spent a lot of time here in Pelekane and did a study over several years, and so these are some of the results from their study. And the big take home is that a lot of things have to be really bad to get that sediment going. The erosion rates based on rainfall, 35 mils per hour, is over an inch of rain an hour to generate the runoff, to actually transport sediment out of the watershed. Wind as well is not as significant in moving erosion, picking it up and transporting it through the air as you know, I'd assume, and maybe others as well. But you need 33 miles per hour wind just to get lift, which is quite significant. So the fastest erosion is happening in some of the smallest areas, which are these bare areas, and which is they're generated from airfall events and really fine soils, kind of that baby powder type feel of soils. Go ahead.
And I mean, the good news is we now have more science that's really helping to guide management efforts in the watershed, and that's something that we didn't have really in the past.
So that they were able to create this area, this map of critical areas, which are shown in red here, based on some of the erosion processes that are happening, and their sampling on the lands. So you see those red areas are based on overland flow.
And this has really allowed us to prioritize and focus our treatment efforts to these really critical areas.
So what are these efforts on the ground? What do they look like? Well, one of the obvious ones is fencing. You see a picture of a really nice fence put up in 2010. It's the Pelikane watershed boundary fence, and no fence should be, no fence project should be taken up unless you're planning to do a lot of maintenance yearly for at least the life of the fence of 20 years or so. And you see some of that maintenance on the right. And it's for the cows, but it's also for the goats, which is probably the primary thing. So the goal is to keep the goats out of the watershed. Oh, sorry. And you see the orange collar on the goat too. If folks don't know that, that's a Judas animal. It's a goat. It's a tracking collar, so the hunters can find the animals, making them easier to remove.
And that's one of the ongoing projects at the moment is to do some feral ungulate control and try to reduce the numbers of goats within the Pelikane watershed as a way to help with our revegetation efforts within the watershed. Another strategy that has been implemented over a couple decades now, that I think has been really important to try to help heal the land of the Pelikane watershed, you know, for sure, is working to improve rangeland management, or kind of improve the grazing of the landscape. Historically, like in the, you know, before the early 1990s, there were only 2 large paddocks in the lower part of the Pelikane watershed. So the area below Kohala Mountain Road. And over the years, with grant funding, the landowner and land users were able to add cross fencing and decrease the paddock sizes. So Parker Ranch was able to make the paddock sizes smaller by adding the cross fencing, so that now there are 16 paddocks within the watershed. The paddock sizes, while they're smaller than what they used to be, are still considered to be on the large side. You know, in an ideal world, you'd want them even smaller. But it's better than it was. And by having the smaller paddocks, you basically, the cattle are concentrated in the smaller area for a shorter period of time, and they graze the fuel load, which is a fancy word for the grass, but they graze that down more evenly across the paddock. And this is important from a wildfire protection perspective. We have last night's fire to kind of remind us of that the cows can be our friends and they can help graze the fuel load down. But it's also important to make sure that the cows don't overgraze the landscape. And so doing some stubble height monitoring is a way for managers to ensure that they're moving the cattle out of a paddock. They're rotating them out before the grass height gets too low. And there's different stubble heights based on the species of grass. When Parker Ranch created these smaller paddocks, they also had to get water into each of the paddocks. And so That entailed, putting troughs in these paddocks, adding water tanks and pipelines. Again, a lot of effort, and a lot of it was able to be funded through some of the grant programs, again, to help improve the way the land was being grazed.
So two things that have been an option to us as resource managers in regards to wildfire are pre-suppression, those things which you do before a fire to mitigate the effects when a fire actually does happen. And the other one is response planning. So when a fire occurs, what happens? What do you do as the guy on the ground, or what can you help with potentially? So pre-suppression planning on the landscape here has been mostly in the way of fire breaks or fuel breaks. The picture in the upper left is a fire break around a native plant enclosure. And you can see it's not just a bulldozed line in the middle of the fountain grass. We brought an excavator in. We managed it much like you would, professionally built road. It's a water bar. It's a little hard to tell there, but right in the foreground there's a water bar. And we maintain these every year to keep the, one, to keep the erosion down, but two, to just keep the grass off of it. So considering where the best place is to put your fire breaks. Another thing I mentioned was response planning. Response planning to me is knowing whether you want to let an area burn or not to let it burn. So that enclosure that I mentioned, I don't want that area to burn, so I'm going to tell a firefighter, hey, do whatever it takes to protect that, similar to the directive of protecting life and property, right? But there's other areas that may be all right to burn, and you don't need to send a bulldozer in and spend thousands of dollars of resources. So knowing the landscape well to be able to help direct in the case of during a fire response. Some of the other two pictures you see here are part of the grazing management in the area, and a good example of an unburned area in the upper right, and the fuels reduction on the left, and a lot higher fuels on the right. And then, unfortunately, not the same area. We looked for a picture, but we couldn't find one. But this a similar area on the bottom that has been burned, obviously on the right has been grazed quite well, and it didn't burn. And so you see the benefits here, quite obviously, of using grazing to or cattle to suppress wildfire.
This bottom picture is actually quite interesting. I came across it this morning when I was looking through some photos. This is from the 2010 fire in Kawaihae, and the rancher before the fire had put in that fence to protect the riparian area and to protect the Kawaihae community from fire coming from the south, because that was after that big fire that had burned down to Waikoloa, and people were really kind of afraid of fire coming from that direction. And so the whole plan was to have the rancher graze that fence line and keep the grass low on the south side of it to protect the community that was to the north. But ironically, this fire that burned in 2010 started on Kawaihae Road, and it burned through Kawaihae, and it burned in the riparian area that's on the right side of the fence, where there was tons of vegetation, but the fuel break did its job. The grazing did its job by stopping the fire at the fence line. It was just sort of kind of backwards the way it happened, but a little bit of history. Okay, there are some strategies that are used to manage the sediment that's in stormwater runoff. So this picture here on the right is of some check dams in the Pelikani watershed. And check dams and coir logs or wattles are intended to capture sediment that's in stormwater runoff in the flows and let the water continue kind of flowing through. And, you know, these can be effective in doing that, but they don't actually get to the problem of what's generating the erosion that's contributing the sediment that's in the flows. So it's a good stopgap measure to keep erosion from moving, or to keep sediments from moving further down slope, but it's not actually a solution to what's causing the erosion. I've added some other things here. The sediment retention basin, believe it or not, a number of years ago, that was something that was considered, putting a big sediment retention basin at the bottom of the watershed and just letting the stormwater flow collect in that sediment retention basin and let the sediment settle out before the water was released into the ocean. Again, that's kind of an old style way of doing things, hugely expensive. I'm glad that that wasn't pursued. Another idea that was floated around years ago was putting in a channel between Kawaihae Harbor and Pelikani Bay to enhance the circulation and sort of flush some of the sediments that were in Pelikani Bay further out to sea. Army Corps did some studies and found that there actually wasn't enough flow within the harbor to generate that circulation. So that idea wasn't pursued further. And then of course, kind of by default, we're relying on this other method by allowing all the sediment that's flowing into the back of Kawaihae Harbor. The sediment is just collecting in there, and then regularly when ships coming in and barges coming into Kawaihae Harbor start hitting the bottom, the state decides it needs to dredge out the harbor. Again, another expensive solution to manage the sediment in the stormwater flows and not really actually address the problem on the ground.
So here's several photos of an ongoing trial that are trying to do exactly that, address the source of the problem. There's lots of experience here. You know, guys like Jake Merkel have been out there planting. We tried to do some seeding. We tried to do some hydro seeding as well. And down on the right is a site prep technique to kind of break up the soil to make planting easier and improve the infiltration of water too, and hopefully lessen the overland flow. So we're looking at different techniques here that are potentially scalable to address these red areas, these critical erosion areas that we've identified on the map. So, you know, how can we best, most efficiently, not only revegetate the area, but almost more importantly is to stop or slow the erosion and the sedimentation that's occurring. So that there's just as many varied techniques. You've really got to plan each one of your techniques. You know, the issues that come up a lot of the times are seed and seedling availability, water availability, or even planning if you can get away without doing water. There's several techniques, low use water techniques. But you've got to plan out a lot of these things, and you've got to consider what your end goal is. And this trial's end goal is really to find the best technique, best scalable technique to minimize erosion.
And then hopefully the next step would be to try to scale that up and you know, try to do some revegetation on a much larger area and see if that works, which would be really cool in this lower area of the watershed.
So this is, some eye candy here of the goals of what we're trying to achieve. You see the middle picture, there's a bit of irrigation. All those, what you see in that picture primarily are all native species, uholoa, pili grass, and pauhiaka. Beautiful things that are coming back with water in a very dry landscape. Probably not very scalable. But it's giving us an idea of what's possible. And on the left there, we've gotten seedlings to germinate there from broadcast seeding. And on the right, you see a sandalwood coming up in a Sia lantana, which is actually protecting it from cattle. But really, it's the conversion back to some semblance of natives where that is feasible. And it's also for the forage grasses in the rangeland to have those be more hardy, stick around, so that the cattle have something to graze and they're not overgrazing. This is a neat little map produced again by USGS, part of their studies, showing through sampling of soil pits where the forest line used to extend down to the wet forest line. So those green dots would have been wet forested area, and then transitioning to whatever it was at those red dots there. But good information to have and for people to consider when you start talking about expanding watersheds and reforestation. We have data now that says, hey, this is possible. This used to be a forest. It should be possible to restore the forest here in the future.
Another area of focus in the watershed efforts has really been on protecting and restoring riparian areas. Now, these riparian areas, that's just a fancy word for kind of the stream channel and its stream banks. But there are some real benefits to protecting and enhancing these riparian areas. They serve as filters and filter pollutants out of stormwater runoff, thereby protecting water quality. Having the vegetation really decreases in-stream evaporation. And these stream channels often are the only thing protecting some of the remnant native plant communities, because the animals can't, the cattle and the goats can't really get into some of these areas to destroy the vegetation. There really are some long-term benefits to protecting these areas. They may not necessarily have an immediate effect of reducing erosion on the landscape, but if looking at the longer term health of the watershed, I think this is a really critical piece to that. And there are a lot of groups, a lot of entities that are actively working on protecting riparian areas, fencing them off so that cattle and goats can't get in there, and then doing some planting within these areas to expand the native vegetation in there. So I personally find this really exciting, an exciting aspect of these projects.
And big, kudos to people who are doing them, because they're definitely one of the hardest places to work on restoration. Steep slopes, lots of rocks, then the water levels rise, and there go all your plants you put in the ground. There's lots of barriers to having a successful project in these spots.
And then who knows, you know, over the longer term, can we start moving that wet forest downslope? This is this photo shows the forest reserve on the right side, and then the very top of Kawaihae stream coming out of, emerging out of that forested, the forest reserve area into the stream channel, which is not fenced off. But you could sort of envision sort of expanding that forest covered downslope even in some of those grassland areas. So monitoring is always an important part of any watershed project. And it's really important in developing the metrics to measure outcomes of projects to really think about what makes sense for the landscape and the work that's being done. Oftentimes funders want really sort of very scientific monitoring protocols. For example, my current favorite is a funder who wants us to be able to document tons of sediment avoided annually. So it's always harder to document something that you're preventing from happening than, you know, but and we can contort ourselves and we can use modeling and we can come up with that number, but is that really the best measure for success of what we're implementing on the ground? So while I think there's a really important place for the science and that type of monitoring, the erosion monitoring, you know, the number crunching, I think we also need to think a little bit outside of the box and think of other ways to measure success. And the other piece of monitoring is also tracking implementation and just making sure, you know, that if we're supposed to be implementing different practices, or, you know, if we're trying to reach the public, are we being effective in implementing those measures?
So this is an example of the intensity of monitoring. You know, this is USGS, heavy on science. They have a very nice weather station up on the top left, and erosion bars and pins and measurement techniques happening all over the place within Pelikane. But it's so critical, as Carolyn said, to help determine the efficacy of your project and to look at your next project as well, and have that data in hand to say, hey, listen, we've done this, it worked, and we'd like to do more of it.
Yeah. Now this kind of science and this kind of monitoring, this kind of science is really, really critical. And it's, again, been really helpful in helping us kind of more broadly in terms of the partnership and all the partners get funding for projects. But this kind of work is also costly. So it's always trying to balance those things. And then finally, here are just some of the things that we consider to be critical components for success of watershed projects. So again, that collaborative and comprehensive action, you know, let's partner, let's work together. Let's not be duplicating efforts when we can be working collectively on things. It's really helpful to have support of funders, the science community, resource managers. It's really important to build in and think about that ongoing maintenance of the conservation practices that get installed.
this is one of my pet peeves. Is there's so many great projects that have failed because there was never the next year or 5 years down the line. Maintenance.
Because sometimes, you know, the funding's for the installation of the practices and not the ongoing maintenance that's required afterwards. And so it's great while the funding's there, and then it's harder to sustain that maintenance when there's no more funding. And then it's important to really be adaptable and nimble and be able to respond to changing conditions. Whether it's, you know, a fire that just happened, or whether it's drought,
The
you know,
seasonality of
the
the place and
seasonality.
having a really dry season. Yeah.
And then finally, I think one of the most critical components of success is having land user and community engagement in the projects. You know, the people that really live, work, play, and really care about the watershed areas.
Like all of you.
So that's it for our presentation. So I don't know how much time we have, but if anybody has any questions or would like to discuss anything in particular, we're open